John, you organized this, much of your thinking, and certainly the article in Foreign Policy, around three epigrams. Many and small beats few and large. Finding matters more than flanking. Swarming is the new surging. Let's take each of these and see what Victor thinks of them. From the New Rules of War, your article here, I'm quoting, the greatest problem traditional militaries face today is that they are organized to wage big wars and have difficulty orienting themselves to fight small ones. Now here, Victor, perhaps, I'm quoting John, perhaps the best example of a many and small military that worked against foes of all sizes, question of scalability, was the Roman legion. Explain that to my classicist friend Victor Davis Hanson.
Well, he can probably explain it to me. The phalanx was a large single mass, the phalanx of Alexander. I think one of the reasons, and hopefully you'll come to our school and teach about this, but I think one of the reasons that Scipio wins at the Battle of Zama is that Hannibal is still using that rather bulky phalanx.
Phalanx would be how many men under arms, roughly?
Could it be 4,000, 5,000, 6,000?
At where?
No, in an average phalanx.
Yeah, by the classical times of phalanx, it should be 6,000.
6,000.
They were 4,500 to 5,000.
Yeah, and a legion often had 6,000 too, but the legion was kind of in checkerboard fashion, and it could reconfigure and reform in many different ways that the phalanx didn't have.
It was the Lego block of ancient warfare.
Nicely
You could
put.
put them
It
together.
combined aerial and hand-to-hand. So a person would throw a pilum, and they would get the advantage of an aerial weapon, and then they would approach with the gladius. And we know from simulations that the gladius had more penetrating power and cutting flesh, double-edged. And there's some graphic descriptions of cynocephali and the Battle of Pydna, where a phalanx of the Hellenistic brand fought at Legion. And the Greeks were shocked at the level of wounds and the type of wounds. They never encountered that before because they were missing, arms, legs that a person could take off. So I think John's right about that. It was a more flexible, it was based on the phalanx per individual unit, and in some ways of shock, because they could get together.
Could always, yeah. But they scaled up.
It was flexible.
By the way, John, I think we just discussed Afghanistan and Iraq in the previous segment, and it sounds as though you approve broadly of Donald Rumsfeld.
Very much so.
Rumsfeld understood small, fast, swarm. But the Secretary of Defense is able to impose this on the Pentagon establishment for only so long. And when he has to turn to other matters, because the Secretary of Defense has responsibility for a wide array, and you go back to war making, the commanders in the field, the chain of command, they go back to what they know, which is massive, which is mass, material and mass. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, I think that what
Rumsfeld's onto something, but the Pentagon
he was,
itself.
and I think that people had seen Panama, and they'd seen Grenada, and they'd seen the Balkan Air Campaign.
Right.
And the idea was...
People, you mean the generals?
Yes.
Okay.
And the idea was, if you have a traditional division of 16,000 men, say in 1950, and you have a traditional division of 16,000 men in 2000, well, the 2000 division, through air support, laptops, can bring an amount of firepower out of a magnitude probably of 1,000, especially when these weapons are laser guided. So the idea was, according to Rumsfeld, as I understood it, why in the world would you want the same number of Crusader platforms or all of these things when through electronic connections, this 16,000-man division can bring a whole array of firepower and become ipso facto 10 times, 50 times more lethal. Now his opponent said, okay, we grant you that. You guys went in and you took out the Taliban, you took out Saddam.
The opponents believe, broadly speaking, in what came to be known as the Powell Doctrine. Cole and Powell.
They did.
You go in mass.
But what they did, they tweaked
Is that
that.
correct?
Not quite.
All right.
They said that, but there was no criticism of the brilliant three-week takedown of Saddam or the 6-week takedown of the Taliban by that group. They couldn't say we should have taken 300,000. Where the argument came in, and it was a post facto argument, okay, you guys can use these new connections or networks. However, people are people. Human nature's unchanging. When you want to pacify the countryside, you need boots on the ground. So you need 300. I think John was, and the school that Rumsfeld were arguing is, okay, but the problem was not sheer numbers. It was how this 160,000 who were so brilliant in taking out, a 500,000-man army were used as occupation constables.
Okay,
that's where the key is.
All right, so let me sum up the argument as best I understand it and try another analogy. we're hearing a great deal now about cloud computing, where your software, your documents, and so forth exist. It's all out there. You open the laptop and you can bring them. It's almost as though, in some way, you're arguing that more and more and more, the lethal power of the United States exists in a cloud. And you can put small units on the ground and they can summon it to strike, strike, strike. Is that something like what you're saying?
It's part of the story.
Or does that apply only to air power, really?
I think it's a good point, because we have artillery and other capabilities that aren't just aircraft that can do that can be. I like the cloud metaphor a lot. I think it's very good, Peter. But I think also these small units I'm talking about can have their own version of the Gladius and the Pilum. There is a right way to equip them so that they are actually very tough in close combat, because the kind of thing Victor's talking about after the Thunder Run to Baghdad was a very traditional close quarters kind of engagement against people ready to mount insurgency.
All right, now Victor's saying here's where the real argument was, if I understand it correctly. Fine. Move quickly to Baghdad, Rumsfeld, move small, light, fine. Yeah. But then you run into the insurgency. Things go sideways for 3 years, and the argument is we had too few troops on the ground. We went in too light. And that argument seemed to me to gain ground with the public at large, with Capitol Hill, with the press. Yeah. And your argument is it was totally mistaken.
Oh, yeah, without question. I think what happened after that Thunder Run and after the regime was taken down is that the troops who were there were basically concentrated into a few large bases. Here's that few large, instead of distributed in a many and small manner.
Because it was too dangerous to distribute them, right?
Well, I don't think so at all. There were, at the day that statue was pulled down, well over half of the Iraqi people saw the Americans as liberators. It was about a year later that number had dropped to single digits. But we had a great opportunity, and I think it was missed because it was misunderstood at that point. They thought, well, the job is done. The sort of traditionalists thought, well, we ran our blitzkrieg and
so maybe you don't have a few places of concentrated power, but you disperse units of 50 in 1,000 places across Iraq.
Many and small. And by the way, that's how we ended up doing a lot better in Iraq. In 2004, I started lobbying for an outpost network and talking to the insurgents themselves to get them to switch sides, because over half that population was with us. And by George, that's what turned things around.
Victor's nodding. You agree, you buy all of this, right?
Well,
or not?
I have a problem with the traditional defense of why the surge worked. People say the surge, I can't think of a war where 30,000 troops made that much of a difference. So we go from 130 to 160 or whatever the numbers were. But there were a lot of other factors. One of them, obviously, is what John's talking about. Getting people out. When you went, first time I went to Iraq, I went to a compound. Second time, I rode around a Humvee that went to apartment buildings. People were out there. But there were other classical things at work that nobody wanted to talk about. One of them was just this number of attrition. I asked one officer, why is things settling down? Why are the people in Anbar? And he said, we've killed a lot of these blank, blank, blank. And after 5 years, there were a lot of tribal leaders who would tell you that they'd lost their son, their cousin, and it was attrition. That helped, and it coincided with the surge in troops. The other was the message that we sent the world and the Iraqis, that 30,000 was symbolic, that we weren't going to pull out. But the actual numbers themselves, I don't think, would have been determinate without these other factors going on. And where we are now in the intellectual debate is, I think everybody understands, as I said, that Rumsfeld's doctrine really worked with the Taliban. And then the Kagan school came back and said, no, you needed boots on the ground, and they rejected that. And now we're in a third level of development, and it says the boots on the ground may or may not have helped, but it was how the boots on the ground were used. We didn't take the surge and use them the way that the other first 130,000 were used. We took the surge, and then that surge and the 130 all started acting differently. And that begs the question, had they taken the 130 and had them dispersed out, would they have needed the extra 30?